there are plenty of people with voices and platforms who will dissect your work. And if it's coming from an authentic place or just you're not reading the room type of place, consumers will clock it. We're not in a era where we're like simply like blindly buying things anymore. And I think especially so not in beauty.
Welcome back to Demystifying Cosmetics, where we pull back the curtain on the science, strategy, and storytelling behind the products on your shelf. Today, we're talking about an often overlooked but absolutely essential element of the beauty industry, visual storytelling. How do the photos you use communicate your brand's values, philosophy, or even a single product's texture and purpose? To explore this, I'm joined by Anderson, a freelance photographer and creative whose work spans beauty, personal care, and fashion. Through A-Sun Agency and by Anderson, he collaborates with brands and creative directors to craft product imagery that's not just beautiful, but meaningful. Welcome to the show.
Oh, hey, Jennifer. Thanks for such an amazing introduction. Really excited to be here and dive into the show.
Great. When we were talking previously, you had kind of observed that there was a strong technical focus that a lot of the guests I had on. And so this area is unique and also new to me, but very exciting in talking to individuals like you or others that are in more of the voice storytelling of areas that my mind maybe isn't really accustomed to. So I would love to understand and hear about your story and what drew you into the world of beauty and product photography.
Yeah, so beauty was kind of a little bit of a later stage add-on to me. As long as I can remember, I've been an artist. I was a classically trained musician for a while. I did multimedia art and eventually fell into photography, which, as you mentioned, is kind of my main thing these days. In regards to that, though, I'm from the Midwest originally. So I started with I don't know what you imagine there, family portraits,
Okay.
Weddings, what have you. And then I fell into the world of fashion when I was actually traveling in the UK. I became an apprentice to some Italian fashion photographers, which is how I got into the commercial world, which is really exciting. Yeah. But we're here to talk about beauty, of course. And I would say beauty and fashion are, related in many ways. A lot of, obviously, the fashion houses have their beauty lines. So it was kind of a natural progression. But I actually got my intro into the space through the launch of Fenty Beauty, which, as many listeners might know, kind of changed the game in many regards to the industry. I mean, of course, it expanded the shade range, which was what I was part of, the launch visuals there. And then I think it's kind of one of the first celebrity brands that kind of started this trend of personality-based brands. So I've been beauty since this huge transition, and I've seen the industry evolve over the years. It's really exciting. I'm excited to see where it's going now. And that's kind of how I got into this space originally. I mean, I love beauty. It doesn't need an excuse. Desire is reason enough, which I think makes it a lot more accessible and fun to reach different demographics than maybe luxury fashion can.
Yeah. Great. And, your work often feels tactile and intentional. How would you describe your approach or philosophy as a photographer?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends how we're viewing that question, right? Like from an artistic perspective, there's one answer. And then I suppose we can get into this, like from a commercial side of things, you can kind of take that and take a whole new spin to it. But first of all, just viewing photography as art. I think there's kind of two ways to look at it. I know you mentioned tactile and intentional, and I think that those are really interesting and I think fitting words for my work. So I appreciate the keen eye. I view there are two ways to create art in general. One is kind of this traditional, I would say, ego-based creation mindset where, to keep it simply, something happens to you, you store that in your body, you want to express it. I think many artists throughout history, this is kind of a sign of the times, whether it's war, politics issues, this sort of thing. And then there's kind of a bit more, I'd say, abstract way of creating, where you kind of tap into the natural order of things, textures within nature, which I think when we get into beauty, there's a lot of formulas and stuff that kind of utilize these sort of texture moments. And then kind of just understanding what is beautiful and highlighting that when you're creating. So I think to create art, you kind of have to tune out to tap in a little bit sometimes, especially when it comes to commercial work. You don't always need your whole artistic manifesto laid out there for the world to see.
And I guess, kind of leaning into that a little bit more, when you work across so many different brands with different styles, how do you maintain kind of your creative voice, your North Star? I don't know if this happens to you, but, have you ever done a campaign and someone looked and they said, oh, that's absolutely Anderson, or vice versa, when they said, oh my God, that's you, because it was completely, new. So, kind of how do you create that balance of, really developing who you are as an artist, but also flexing to the creativity that you see in and across the industry?
Well, look, I've definitely experienced both of those scenarios you mentioned. And I think this is something, really a self-discovery journey as you continue across your career. I mean, if anyone's listening and wants to get more into this field, I think when you're first starting, you really do have to span that gamut and really understand what is your artistic philosophy. And it's kind of a balancing game of what do I enjoy? What is the market perceiving? For example, me in beauty, I didn't start off in beauty, but it kind of just kept happening. So it's kind of a push and pull there. So I think there's a little bit of flexibility there, especially if you want to make it, say, a career. But as you do get more established, I think you do get to be more selective with your work. And I always ask the question, what is this giving back to me? For example, if I'm getting a really big paycheck on a job, maybe it doesn't fit my style 100%, but it's giving me stability to be able to explore other things which are more interesting.
Yeah.
As opposed to sometimes maybe I'm getting a smaller rate from a job, but it's with an indie brand that has a really interesting creative that fits with me. And it seems maybe counterintuitive, but those things really do play into each other. Big clients will reach out to me because of the indie work that is highly creative, even if maybe for a commercial job, it's a lot more, let's say, diluted. Sometimes with corporate clients, there's a lot of opinions that go into it that kind of create a little bit more of a, let's say, less provocative, stable look, which is important for the market too.
You touched upon kind of your work with Fenty and how, they really expanded the selection and availability of shades. Are there other moments you can share that where your visuals helped a brand to reframe their own story?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, I kind of touched on it, but it really happens with those indie visual moments where I really love working with a founder who has great ideas and is highly creative. And it turns into a really collaborative process where you kind of take your perspective, and I like to think of it, I mean, I work a lot in luxury, right? And there's kind of, I don't know, like a cool kid effect that kind of comes down. It's kind of fun to play with that veil. I think when you work with founders, they kind of think, oh, Anderson has worked with Fenty and he's worked with all these luxury brands. How can I tap into that to elevate my own concepts? So I think it's really fun in those situations to, especially if you're like, for example, last month shot a launch campaign. I did all the social content and then I brought in a second photographer to do the key visuals there. So that was a really fun experience to kind of bring in another artist, use my my video chops and kind of create a whole story. And that'll be rolling out in October of 25. So it's going to be really cool to see essentially the whole process and vision all over their channels. Awesome. So that's always really fulfilling.
We'll have to link it to this when it launches.
Definitely.
And so, you talked a little bit about collaboration with the founder. Let's get into the weeds a little bit on that. What does that collaboration process typically look like between you, a brand, maybe a creative team, but more importantly, that owner, that key stakeholder, the brand owner?
Yeah, so I assume we're kind of talking a little bit more on the indie side of things here. Yeah, typically that's a little bit more of a personal relationship, I would say, in terms of maybe not personal life, but let's just take it in contrast. So first of all, if I'm working with like a large corporate client, there's typically a lot of like voices, right? So you have the brand side. Sometimes there's a creative or ad agency. So there's a lot of opinions to manage. So I kind of mentioned before, sometimes that sort of dilutes ideas a little bit. Yeah. For messaging, I could go on, but when we're working with a founder specifically, there's a lot more room to really explore that creativity. Sure. But it can also pose some challenges, especially let's say the founders are a really big expert in skincare, and that's why they founded that brand. Maybe they're a little bit lacking on the creative side of things. Maybe they don't know how to articulate the benefits of their product into images. So then that sort of becomes a conversation as well. And I think it's important as well. My background's in production, photography, of course. I do think it's good to also refer out to creative help when it's possible, because when we're on a set working, it's easy to kind of dump everything onto a photographer and say, you need to art direct, you need to creative direct, pose, all of these things. And then you start at some point, let's say, losing quality maybe, and I'm not paying attention to where my focus is or the lighting. So there's just a lot to keep in mind. And I think understanding the structure of a job is really important when you're diving in, and also setting expectations with the founder.
Yeah. And is there like a go-to set of questions that you found have worked to really, like kind of tease apart the information you need? Like, why did you make this product? Who do you think this product is for? What are your brand values? Have you found a nice routine of questions that, start to pull at what you need in order to create these assets?
I mean, look, I think everyone kind of comes to the table with a little bit of a different experience. Some founders are really passionate and they know exactly what they want, and you can kind of build it just from having a conversation with them. Others, it kind of needs a little bit more of that structure of a kind of list of questions. Luckily from working in the high-end commercial world, you kind of see a lot of these decks come through, so you sort of know the questions to ask. But I think the real trick is translating whatever information you're getting into a visual language, which I think is maybe the more interesting side of things there. I mean, look, of course, there's lighting, casting, all of those sort of things, which creatively show what your brand is and how it shows up. But I think it's also equally important to understand, like, where is that content living?
Yeah.
I think now, especially with social media, and this is something my agency deals a lot with, is people still want to shoot like $1 million campaign and then just tack on a behind the scenes photographer for $1,000 and call it done.
Yeah.
But the reality is, unless you're, I don't know, Prada, if you're a small brand, you're probably driving most of your sales from social and this kind of world building. And I think in many cases, devotion for product is kind of built on an algorithm. And, there are countless examples of how this works. But I think building it from a social point of view up and then expanding into, okay, what's working really well on social? How does that work for key visual on a campaign, hero landing site, and things like that? Especially if you're, again, with founders, a lot of the time there's not so much maybe budget behind something as a large client would have.
Yeah. So this is funny. I bring this up because sometimes when I am doing products for, development, what I'm photographing is like, oh, it's separated. Look at this. And, it's like very clear. I have like a photo box I do it in. But, conversely, how do you, can you give an example of visual cues or storytelling devices that help to communicate something that is like, technical sophistication of a formulation that, otherwise when, at appearance is just a white cream.
Yeah, of course. Well, look, I think what you're speaking to a lot is like very like skincare, and I've seen this so much. Obviously, color cosmetics, you have a whole different
a lot more to play with
ball
there.
Game. Yeah. But with skin, you're right. It's very like you have to be very specific. I think a good first test for any brand is if, like, for example, everyone knows creme de la mer. If I showed you a creme de la mer ad and I covered up the product, you'd probably still know it was a La Mer ad. And I think that's a great way to test your visual language. Like, is this my brand?
Mm.
Is the vibe right?
Yeah.
And then from there, we can kind of build out, right? Like, okay, where is this living? For example, I just shot a visual merch display for Sephora for a skincare client. Very exciting. One of the key visuals there was just a girl smiling. Maybe that doesn't seem like a lot, but if you're pairing it with a whole bunch of assets, maybe there's some key information on that display. Then it kind of begins to tell a full story. So that's one way I think is like, where is it living?
Yeah.
Obviously, a completely different story for a social media video, right?
Yeah.
And then I think I mentioned before lighting, color, and all these things. I think there is a sense of this needs to stay in the same visual world as the brand, right? But then let's say we're doing an SPF cream, which is very big these days. But it's part of a larger launch of other skin. How do you differentiate that white cream, right? I think one way from a like purely technical photography point of view is keeping a similar lighting setup, but adding a light source that adds a bit more of a sunny feel to it. So it still feels in line with the rest of the campaign, but then you have a sunny cream. Maybe there's a couple shots with the product. And then it's really in terms of, what does that copy look like? How does the ad lob look on the hero image on the site? And this is what I mean, where it's really important to be collaborative. I can do so much with photography and I can make it look great, but how those assets are being used is really important too.
Yeah.
I've delivered files to founders before and they just kind of put them up on the website with no cropping or any context, and it kind of falls flat. That's just a bit of an education piece, I think, in terms of how are we using these assets and how can we tell the best story with them. And then also, if you're dealing with a budget, sometimes a crop can change the complete story of an image, and you can use it in maybe 2 areas and tell a completely different story with that.
Okay, real quick. Raise your hand if you have dealt with active instability. If you have ever opened a jar of retinol cream and smelt an off odor, or noticed your formula went dark brown, chances are you are dealing with active instability. It's never fun when the formula you've been working on goes south and the due date is only days away. That's why we've encapsulated the trickier ingredients to work with so you can kick the stability struggle to the curb. From retinol to vitamin C, we make it easier to work with those ingredients that typically give you that 3 p.m. headache. The cellulose shell shields the active from outside exposure. You know, things like air and light that are likely to cause active breakdown, giving you the power to create stable and effective formulas without the trial and error. Ready to quickly create effective skincare formulas? Discover Tagra's Cellucapse line by going to tagra.com/Cellucapse. So, have you encapsulated yet? Now back to the show.
In thinking about, and you and I touched upon this, how brands are visually expressing values like diversity, inclusion, and representation.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see the subtlety in ways of imagery that can support that or undermine those values?
Sure. I mean, I think the first thing is to look at brands who are doing it really well. I mean, we keep going back to Fenty, but they were one of the people who really pushed that change. I mean, I work on castings these days and we're shade matching for like 60 shades sometimes. That's because of a really authentic, real passion in the industry. And I think that's so important to look at. I think another big one in a completely different sphere is MAC. They've been doing VivaGlam for years, where they actually obviously donate portions of their proceeds to research. And then they've done collaborations with Keith Haring and all of that sort of thing too. So these are very authentic examples of brands that infuse it into their DNA. Now, when we're talking about subtle or not subtle imagery, I mean, it's not beauty, but I'm sure everyone's listening has seen the like American Eagle jeans scandal. Not so subtle.
Yeah.
I mean, look, we're not in the era anymore where we can just like pay media to not report on something.
Yeah.
There are plenty of people with voices and platforms who will dissect your work. And if it's coming from an authentic place or just you're not reading the room type of place, consumers will clock it. You know, we're not in a era where we're like simply like blindly buying things anymore. And I think especially so not in beauty. But it's funny, I think a week or two after that American Eagle scandal, Gap came out with a jeans ad, which was completely different, totally diverse, felt really authentic. And Gap has really been having a moment, which is funny. They're, I think, having like a big comeback right now. It's super cool.
It is. I know,
yeah.
having been, a 90s era teen. Yes, I'm psyched on that. And, in talking about authenticity, how that I struggle a lot with that, and I do appreciate the idea and thoughts of authenticity, but often am unsure how brands can convey that in visual storytelling. What tips or tricks do you have in terms of helping a brand to feel authentic in what they're doing when they're needing to maybe adjust to evolving perspectives or demographics or socioeconomic changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think you should know your consumer, first of all. I think that's something that's so overlooked. I think the idea sometimes is just like make the most money. We need to make conversions and stuff, but like really, who are you selling to?
Yeah.
And you need to understand that and understand what their values are, right? Like, for example, MAC Cosmetics, again, obviously it's a very like artsy, edgy, queer scene, and they understand that very well, and they authentically market to those people, and that's diverse. They don't need to necessarily hit every single box, and I think that's something brands try to do as well. And when you stretch yourself too thin, at the end of the day, that's gonna
you can't
it's not,
make a product for everybody.
Absolutely. And then I think, if you're trying to do that gut check of like, is this going to resonate? Does this feel authentic? Look at the brands that are doing it well.
Yeah.
It's not, in my opinion, rocket science. You don't need to make something internet breaking. Maybe you want to, but usually that happens on accident. I think look to the brands that are doing it well, be authentic with your consumers. I mean, don't do anything that's discriminatory.
Yeah,
Obviously that goes without saying, but I don't know. I feel like some people need to hear that. And also tap your network of professionals. For example, one thing that can really skyrocket your brand, in my opinion, is good casting director.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, especially if you're trying to hit diversity points in whatever realm that is for you, hire someone who knows where those people are and like is authentic with that. The casting for, again, MAC is going to be way different than something for, I don't know, Shiseido, for example. So it's just understanding that. And then going back to knowing your consumer. How does the consumer see themselves in your ad? I think that's a big question to ask yourself too.
Yeah. And so because this is all new to me, and I know we talked a little bit about like indie versus kind of legacy brands, but talking about budget and that, you're kind of like, oh, a casting director, which again, I wouldn't even know what that is. So if this is a little off script, so play along with me here. But, if I'm working with let's start with an indie brand, limited budget. What would your advice be for how they can get the most bang for their buck? Who do they need in the room, in your opinion?
Yeah. I mean, look, even the term minimal budget can mean so many things for so many brands. People come to me, say, I have minimal budget, and they'll say I have $1,000. I'm like, I don't know what I can do for you for that amount. I'm so sorry. Now, if we're getting into like 10,000, maybe there's something we can start working and to get a quality. I'm always a proponent of creativity being not fixed on budget, but it's true at some point there are certain assurances that you do buy. You're paying for results, not for, let's hope this goes well. So I think, again, this is kind of a place where I'm really exploring and excelling in right now in terms of, I tapped on it before, but like, we don't need to spend $1 million to get a good campaign. If you have the money for it we can make some really great assets, amazing. But I think it's more beneficial to view it from a social first perspective. Capture all that collateral that you need, get you going for 6 months to a year, depending on whatever your launches are. And then getting really smart and nimble with how to repurpose that content. Right? So say you have a whole bunch of video footage that can be a 15-second social ad. Maybe you can put it on your website banner for a launch, and then you can get some stills out of that too. I think volume is really important for small brands. And then also the strategy behind that is really important as well. But yeah, I would say, does that answer your question?
A little bit, but I'm also curious, when you talk about it, again, the casting director example,
Sure.
and then lighting and how, being in a fractional role, right? You can have the ability to say, I'm only going to work on this. Let's say I come to you and I have this brand or website, I'm selling, a few SKUs, and I'm like, I need you to take photos. But I also, am naive and technically focused. What are the recommendations for who else needs to be in that setting other than you? What is your ideal sphere of people to curate a launch?
Absolutely. Yeah. So starting with the casting director, that's definitely a nice to have. Those can get expensive. But I would say need to have is obviously photo, video. Sometimes that can be one person. Hair and makeup is very important, especially obviously in personal care cosmetics. That's a big one. You need talent, obviously, to do the products on. I'm on team no AI here for models. Lighting equipment, I think, is always important. You can do without, but going back to the idea of shaping your brand story, you should kind of have a visual playbook, which is concepted by lighting. And then I'd say, again, the most kind of important part there is like, when we're going back to this idea of photography, creative vision, that sort of thing, if you are a small brand, you should really find a photographer that you align with their vision. So that synergy is already there, as opposed to going to someone who maybe has worked for all the big brands and you kind of get allured by that.
Yeah.
But I think that personal relationship for a small brand is really important. You really want someone that's advocating for you and doing the best and not just at it for a cash grab.
Yeah. Being an individual, and I worked for a long time consulting in that fractional role, I found more often than not that was a common denominator, was having somebody advocate for you when you don't know what you don't know.
Yeah. Well, the creative industry, it's based on personal relationships.
Yeah.
Like I have makeup artist friends whose day rates are like really a lot, but they're great artists, but we have a great relationship. And I say, hey, there's this cool brand. I really like the founder. They have a great vision. You'll get some great images for your book. Can you come in at this rate? We'll have fun. We'll have a day. We'll hang out. We'll have some lunch, make some good images. And that's that. And then the favors like always returned in some other capacity. So
awesome. What beauty product or trend are you currently inspired by, either personally or creatively?
I just did a New York Fashion Week runway, and they put, yeah, I know, I sometimes get in front of the camera too, but they put blush all on my cheeks, and I don't know, I kept it on after the show. I was like, I kind of like this. And I think another thing that's big now is I've seen a lot of brands do kind of like lip product as a blush kind of combo. So instead, they'll put it on the lips and then they'll blend it out on the cheeks too. I think that's cute.
Yeah. Awesome. I've been seeing a lot of men doing their nails now in that I'm loving.
Yes. I need to. I don't have anything.
I don't know. I can't do things with them, so I don't know them do it. But I've seen that, and I've found it to be a great trend. So you also walk the New York Fashion Show as well as photograph it. How do you think those two play into? Do you think that because you are behind the lens, it makes you better apt at knowing, where you should be looking? How does that relationship exist for you?
Sure. I mean, I think a media production is like a huge ecosystem, and the more different perspectives you can see it from, the better. Yeah. I mean, I've produced things, I've shot things, and I've been in front of the camera too. I just have a better understanding of how everything works. And, it's good when you're working with models too. There's a little bit of relatability there. Yeah. As a photographer, I find the less us versus them in a project, the better.
Well, for those listening, where can we find your work and get in touch with you?
Absolutely. All my socials are at by Anderson X, and you can view my agency website, a-sun.agency, and all my contact info is really easy to find on those places. So
wonderful.
Feel free to get in touch.
Well, thank you. This has been great. I'm really looking forward to launching this and linking it to some visuals so that listeners can see and kind of track along with what we've talked about. So I thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.